butterflies and insects on, which seems to have disappeared somewhat here. But again, it's just, this piece really came, again, it's a bit similar to the control room, that architecture, or the sort of idea of the structure of the space came first, in that I wanted to make a space that felt very sort of modern, very hermetically sealed, with this kind of, almost, I suppose I thought of the curtain as a kind of filter between the outside and the inside, and this sort of world of insects developing on the inside. But because the carpet is green, I kind of wanted to have a slight inside-outside feeling with this piece. And I think, different pieces have been as well informed by different places where I've been at the time when I made them. Because before this, I spent 2 months in Berlin, and I think actually spending the time there and seeing particularly sort of architecture in East Berlin is what made me think of building a space like this in the first place. This piece, this piece was made during a residency in Artsway in the New Forest. It feels quite a different place to work compared to being in London. And it's quite strange because everything feels very perfect in the New Forest. So it's a perfectly presented piece of nature, and it felt like there must be this quite dark, probably underside to it somewhere. And really with this piece, what I wanted to do was to have this feeling that there was some kind of technical processes having been worked out in here through these diagrams on the walls and the switches and so on, but that also maybe this had in some way broken down, and we had this sort of remnants of this kind of party, but there's plans in the corner and bits and pieces that left over from that. And also, one thing I've become interested in as well through the series is thinking about how to close through painting a photograph can become just in terms of how it's almost flatten out the image and allow it to have a sort of perspectival space at the same time. So just sort of allowing things to rise up to the surface of the image objects and almost become like marks and gestures across the surface, as well as actually sitting within the illusory space of the photograph. This is the final image, which I just finished. So again, it's kind of linked back to science and sort of slightly maybe warped approach to science. And I had a lot of this science equipment for a really long time. I wanted to use it for a long time, but it's got such a sort of, drawing attached to it in some ways. It was quite hard to work with, but I wanted to work with it in a way that showed that it wasn't really functional in the way that one would maybe have expected it to be, and it's almost become more decorative, but at the same time there was some kind of system or order going on through the way in which things have been grouped together and things are labelled and notes are put on, and then the suggestion that through this door with the red light, perhaps that's actually where all these things are taken to be used. And I think that's it, that's the last image.
Very much, Anne. I'd now like to welcome both Anne McNeill and Trish Morrissey onto the stage for In Conversation. Anne McNeill, Director of Impressions Gallery, which has now moved to Bradford and is opening in a purpose-built, purpose-designed gallery in 2007. Impressions originally commissioned Trish to make a new body of work, of which 7 years was one result. The exhibition has toured throughout the UK, France, Ireland, and is shown at Yossi Miller Gallery in New York with an accompanying publication. I'd like to welcome you both onto the stage.
3 days' time. And so I say, she goes into labour, I'm having the gas in there. Welcome. We're going to talk about Trisha's piece, 7 Years. And the start of this was, we're talking about family photographs basically. We all have snapshots that we keep in boxes and envelopes. We never look at them, we never show them to anyone. We also have some snapshots that, you know, are informal, but we make it for whatever reason onto the fridge door, they're by a magnet. And then we have the proper ones. These are the ones that people have deemed them to be important, like wedding photographs, things like that. And they're hung in a private place in the lounge or on top of your television set. And that was the start of the whole project, wasn't it, Trish? The other thing is I've got to do with So for me, 7 years investigates the nature of the family through the conventions of family photography. What was the thinking behind this and the genesis of the family?
Well, I have been, is this my phone? Can you hear me? No.
Yeah.
Sorry. I had been doing a sort of an extended project which had been part of my MA work between 2000 and 2001 in Ireland with my parents and the house that I had been brought up in, and they'd lived in since they got married in 1958, I think it was. And I was sort of doing this project which was using documentary photography as a sort of a format to actually create, I would create spaces, I would make arrangements to meet them at a particular time or in a particular room of the house, having already got this idea in mind of what I wanted to do. And then I would sort of suggest this scenario and allow them to sort of stand or relate to each other in a particular way. And this project was sort of ongoing. It was quite a long process, and I sort of, you know, a lot of repetition went on and that sort of thing. But part of the whole process meant that I spent a lot of time with my parents, which I hadn't done since I was a kid, and I hadn't lived there for 15 years or more. And part of this process was going through our history and going through old photographs, which basically the old photographs, our family album is in fact a huge big wedding cake box into which all sorts of photographs are fired in there without any order on them whatsoever. There's like photographs of my great grandparents who were very wealthy and had studio portraits made in the 1800s, through to wedding photographs of my grandparents and their own wedding photographs, right the way through to, you know, pictures from the 50s and 60s and 70s with nothing written on the back at all as to who or what they were. Right the way through to pictures I was sending them of themselves that I had just taken on, you know, sort of small print so that they could have a record of the project, all just fired into this box without any rhyme or reason, everything getting dog-eared cornered. And I thought, oh my God, this is our history. That's just, it'll go with them because they're in their 70s now.
So is that, you want to talk about?
Sorry, I'm only looking at rein it in there. Just to conclude, what I started doing was realising that as I was talking to them about, I'd hold up a photograph and I'd say, who's in this and what's going on? And they'd argue about the context. They wouldn't argue normally about who's in the photograph, they'd often argue about when it was taken and where it was taken. And we'd reach a consensus, and I would write on the back what we had decided. And you know, this is family history, it's now been written, and it hadn't been written before. I became really interested in the whole idea of imposing an order onto something that was made without an order. And also I became interested in family relationships and how they develop, and how you're given a role, or a role is imposed upon you almost as a child. You know, you have within a family setting, you have the sporty one, you have the girly one, the pretty one, the whatever one, and these roles are sort of, they're forced upon you often, although you know, outside the family you can change your role.
But often once you've been given that in the family, it never changes.
And it never goes. 50 years later, you'll still be going home, and you're still and you fall into that role.
Yes.
And this photograph is the first photograph I didn't. What I wanted to do was to actually make a photograph that was about that, about those roles, and about yes, it's suppose this is the first picture from 7 years.
my maid is thinking about myself age 7 and my sister age 14.
Because it might be quite apt to see how the titles and
Well,
came about.
that's where it came about at a later point, because
Yeah.
this photograph was in 2001, and then it was completing itself. I thought I had done it. It was in a drawer. It was, it didn't have any more meaning. It just was itself.
Yeah.
So that led you on to
I actually sort of looked at the blog for the conference, but I didn't deconstruct it as closely as David. And sort of said, wanted to ask you if 7 years was about reconstructing past events, or is it about something else?
It's not. It's a mixture of many different things. I mean, there is obviously my own history is in there because there is a biographical element to it. But really, again, I mean, this photograph shows in some ways those personalities that may have been beginning of why you have these roles then.
I quite like the pecking order.
The pecking order, the sort of the whole body language. I mean, you can really tell the sort of the personalities coming out.
Yes. And on that point about body language, I mean, that was something you were very clear about throughout the whole body of work, that you wanted to pick up on the gestures and the facial expressions of how, using the conventions of family photography, how that interacts.
Yes, exactly. I was very conscious of how, you have a sort of, when you're photographing a sort of family environment, or in any sort of, when you're photographed at all, not even in a family environment, but in any way, you immediately set yourself up. You start to perform, and it's a subconscious thing, or it's actually a learned thing. We just sort of absorb through living and through looking at photographs and through knowing how photographs. You just know how to pose. You immediately, I mean, my little nieces, they immediately know how to pose. They're only sort of like 3, and it's something that's there. And I think that what happens is that you can set yourself up. You can set your face in such a way that you're thinking, this is how I should be. But sometimes the body actually is the truth, and so you have. You set up your photo face, but your subconscious almost leaks out into gestures. This is actually in psychological terms called leakage.
Yeah.
Where you have when it leaks into the body, and how you stand and how you hold yourself actually has more truth to how you're feeling or how you are.
Do you want to talk a bit about July the 14th, 1974? In terms of the interaction between the two characters?
Yeah, I just turn the screen so this rather than just turn it I can't.
Just been told it's the other slide.
Sorry. We can talk about both actually quite quickly, but this one in particular, I think this is about being sort of in an environment. My idea about these two characters, because I think of all of the people as being characters, even though they're obviously my sister and myself. We're taking on different roles at all times, so we're never actually really being ourselves. We're being sort of family album types. We're being characters that you find in any family album, and these are the sort of the reluctant, the truculent teens who are on a sort of family holiday, who have sort of created sort of like satellite encampment, sort of like separate them from the family, so they feel this sort of like some sort of independence being found, and the standing figure is sort of being told to stand, being told to look happy, and is looking anything but happy because they're being told to, and it's what you do the opposite to what you're being told. And the other woman, the other teenager, the other girl who's sort of seated has that sort of there's no connection between the two of them, and yet they're sitting on a rug. There's a sort of she's looking off into the distance. She's looking off at something that we can't really see, and we wonder what that is.
Shall we move on to the next slide?
Yeah.
Well, what I was going to talk about was bring up that 7 years inhabits a particular cultural perspective. It is of like the 70s and 80s, and I guess that comes about, it reflects your age, and for a lot of us in the audience, these sort of generic family snaps remind us of the snaps we have in those boxes. Do you want to talk? You will talk more about how you got that authenticity of the 70s and 80s and your work process. Let's say that.
To this slide of the rabbit, which is just 2 back.
That's a new idea.
That one. Yes. I mean, because it's based in the family house or in and around the family house, there's already a sort of a setting there which I was able to work with. So things were dressed up or dressed down in certain ways. Some things haven't changed, like for example, the wall hasn't changed for this photograph. The grass is the same. I did have to ask neighbours to remove cars from various driveways, having to climb over the wall in little silly shorts. That's me on the left-hand side. With a wig on and various sort of things which were quite bizarre. But because the subject of the photograph isn't the setting, or isn't the clothes, or isn't the styling. They're tools in a way that are used, to sort of make the photograph really authentic, so that I can actually talk about other things. Like for example, this one, the relationship between the adult figure and the child figure is the same as the relationship between the child figure and the animal. So you have this sort of idea of, in one way, controlling hand, but you also have the idea of the nurturing hand. And I think that in some ways that sums up what family life is. There is always that conflict between being sort of kept and trapped and being nurtured. Whereas that line is kind of. Yes, you can. Sorry.
Again, I was a late substitute for Working Knees because Richard from Source Magazine said if I didn't want to look like surplus to requirement, it's best to do something, so we haven't worked. Right. The thing that strikes me also about 7 years, and it was also picked up by Claire Flannery when she reviewed the exhibition when it was on at the Gallery of Photography in Dublin, is that there's a certain amount of wit in these images. It's all right to laugh with the image, but then she, carefully picked up the fact that, and she said, as is often the case with a light-hearted delivery, something deeper lurks within the photographs. Would you agree with this review?
Absolutely, no. I mean, a lot of people say, when they see the photographs, you must have had such fun making them. And in fact, the making of them wasn't fun at all because my sister was, this whole project was imposed upon her in a very insidious way. I didn't sort of say, well, I've got a great idea for these set of pictures that we're going to make. It's going to take 2 years of your life. We're going to have to repeat them over and over again. It's going to be very cool because it'll be in the garden and there'll be all the neighbours looking at, none of this sort of, I've lost my train of thought now.
You were talking about why it's all right to use wit.
Oh, that's right, yeah. So, and they
but
look
there was
like
a more
fun.
complex
That's
idea
right.
going on.
They look like fun, and the wit that's there, I hope, comes across. But actually, the making of them was quite traumatic because she was very reluctant.
But it's not just in the making of them, I think, that there's a more complex idea going on. It's that notion that you were talking about earlier about the gestures and the controls and all that.
That's right. I mean, each photograph is incredibly constructed. They're repeated over and over to get right because at any point, if anything is inauthentic, the whole illusion falls apart and the photographs cease to work.
Yeah, there was, while working with Trish when she was making the art, and I would go down to London every couple of months and look at the contact sheets, and neither of us can really articulate this, but we knew through looking at some of the ones that didn't make it into the show, there was something wrong with one of the gestures or just one of the facial expressions.
It's all hung on the face.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And it just had to go, no matter how perfect the props were, it just had to go, yeah. Coming on to, I know, again, a lot of people will link your work with the seminal Joe Spence work, Beyond the Family Album. And I do know that you're clear that this isn't what 7 years is about. Joe's interest was about, the person being photographed, having a say in their representation. What do you want to say 7 years is about?
Gosh, yeah, Joe Spence, a lot of the time that her work was made was very important to the work, I think. Because in the 70s and 80s, there was, the sort of feminist movement was still very strong. And I think that, people like me benefit from that now. And I think this kind of work can only be made almost after that work, because while this isn't about subjectification or objectification, it's about photography of the language. It's about the idea of vernacular, or the language of everybody, which in a way she's using too. But this work isn't phototherapy at all. It's kind of it's playing with how we read things and about
how we read family photographs.
or photograph snapshot photographs maybe, and sort of layers of meaning that you can sort of scrape away.
Yeah, I know another artist that you're often linked with is, and Tricia tells me this is a heavy cross to bear, is Cindy Sherman. You know, the untitled film stills and the history portraits. What do you see as the difference between your work and her work?
I think I'd like to think that with her work, that, you know, hers is often about masquerade rather than, and I would say that my work is more about camouflage. That
Sort of masquerade in terms of pretense, or?
Well, in terms of with her, you can always see, you always see her through whatever she posted herself, particularly not so much with film stills, but certainly with the later history portrait, the genre painting portraits. You can always, like, makeup is badly applied, and you know, props are kind of, you can almost see through them. The way that in some ways Gillian Waring's recent family album work as well, the eyes were always left, so there's this sort of clue to who was really behind them that was there. Whereas, so I see that as being sort of, you know, you can see through, but you can't. There's always the real person there. Whereas I tried very hard to actually.
Which is this good one that's up January the 25th, 1979, in which your character is like, you know, the disillusioned youth.
Yes.
Where, do you want to talk about that, or the image speaks for itself and this notion of camouflage?
Well, I think, I mean, there's lots of different things going on there, but in terms of the, you know, the reading of the photographs, you know, you have these, you can look at it in terms of, you know, a sort of familiar fabric that you may have had in your home, or, you know, sort of a lot of people say to me that the character on the right-hand side looks just like their brother did, or looks just like a friend of the family, or looks just like their uncle, or there's always something about them that's incredibly familiar. And you can look at it in that way, and then you can look at it in terms of the actual gestures there. There's, sort of there's the tension of the hands, there's the cut-off figure, and then there's the youth who's sort of taking back control of the image by the rude gesture that he's doing in a very surreptitious way that, you know, I mean, sometimes it's the sort of the gravity or something, but this is sort of a little bit more, you know, truculent, again, not wanting to be there, and show it, you know, taking back control by ruling the photograph.
I've got, not just take a minute, a little anecdotal story about this image. When Trish was making this work, we also at Impressions ran workshops for a creative women's writing group over 50s, which they were all over 70. And Trish worked with them looking at their snapshots with magnifying glass and looking at gestures and taught how to deconstruct images. And one of the really amazing things at Trish's opening at the party, this 70-year-old woman came up to me, took me by my hand, took me over to this image and explained to me and what was going on. And I just think that's a marvellous thing, you know, to make people visual literate, and it was just one of those nice things that happens at work now and again.
Didn't realise you were actually the boss.
No, because I blend in so well and no one listens to me. I'll just go through these and any particular ones that you want to. Again, that's like mimicking the language of family snapshots. It's August 8th, 1982. Do you want to say briefly why they've been, there's no names and it's just dates? See, it's all right to laugh with the image.
I wanted to leave it a little, you know, like I was saying about the sort of imposing order upon these random photographs that my parents had. I wanted to leave the reading of the photograph to be open, and so that people can reflect on their own experience. So that it's not, I'm not telling you who these people are. You can decide who they are, because they probably look like people that you already know, or characters that you already know. So I wanted to set it in a very specific place and time by giving it a date, not a place but a time, by giving it a date, so that it gave sort of an anchor that you could hold on to, but without actually defining the photograph, so that the viewer is left to sort of make up to sort of finish the dialogue, rather than, you know, to finish the narrative in their own heads.
I think we're sort of coming to the end. Is there any points that I haven't managed to bring up that you'd like to?
No, I think that's probably covered everything.
Again, in the little conference thing, it just points out that Tricia is a photographer, artist who's recently moved into video, and we'd like to end this little chat showing one of 1845, which was a video piece that was part of the show at Impressions. Tricia's work Impressions had the title New Works, and it consisted of 3 pieces, of which 7 Years was one, and 2 other video pieces. We don't really want to talk about this piece, we just think it speaks for itself.
In the context of the
In the context, yeah. So, roll DVD, please.
I'm sure everybody's dying to ask questions. So at this point, for the next 20 minutes, I'd like to invite all the morning speakers up onto the stage. And Julia Peck is going to come up and chair a question and answer session. I believe there are 2 roving mics, so if you have a question to ask, you just put your hand up and if you wait a second till the mic reaches you.
to first of all ask David a question about his talk that he started today with. And I hope this isn't actually too painfully obvious, but one of the things that came to mind in the talk was that there seemed to me to be a Baudrillardian quality about many of the contemporary works you showed, in that they photograph simulations of similar art forms, and in a sense the photographs became a representation of a representation. Now I'm not sure if that's a wee bit too loaded in connection to what you were trying to do in your talk, so if you could pick up on that, it would be great.
Yeah, that seems half right, only in the sense that I think people tend to half interpret Baudrillard. They take the simulation bit, but they don't often take on the really interesting remarks that he's made about photography. Don't think that's me. About photography's dependence on the actual. The Baudrillard line I really like. I mean, I know the simulation stuff, and that's what gets, that's the funky bit that gets everyone excited or depressed or whatever. But the great Baudrillard line for me is the fact that he says the magic of photography is that it's the object that does all the work. You can't have photography without subject matter. You can't. So, yeah, you're right, but I think in that sort of trade-off between photography as descriptive of surfaces, but surfaces themselves in the contemporary world being a site of betrayal or misinformation or something, then yeah, I think a lot of this work is Baudrillardian in both of those senses, not just in that simulation sense, but this is highly descriptive on one, just optically, photographically. It's what really attracts a lot of photographers to the medium. We'd have thought, if we were sort of naive, we'd have thought that all of that would have been sort of jumped, but that returns. That's what a lot of contemporary photography of artists and photographers really like about the medium. It really is descriptive. And then the debate about the status of that description starts. But nobody's really making an argument now with photography's capacity to describe. The argument is now with the surface of the world, and not so much with photography.
Good, thank you. Would anybody else like to comment on that in relation to the practice? No. Okay. That's a great part of the theory and practice for you. Would anybody in the audience?
It's a great reason to mind.
Okay, would anybody from the audience like to ask a question? Okay, can we have the microphone in the front row, please?
Yes, indeed. I would like to pose a question concerning your lecture, David. As in a way you ended your lecture with a question, what have, or at least I understood like that, what have those attraction, or what has this attraction, what have these sides of military police on the one hand side and leisure places and TV porn and all that in common? What is the binding? And I'm sure you will also, in a way, you answered this also in some points in your talk. But I think it was so suggestive to immediately answer. Well, yes, it is about fantasies of control and the control of fantasy. And what I thought maybe we could discuss this also connecting to other lectures. Would be interesting to get a point also from this to your very issue, the connections between art and documentary and photography, because you mentioned it, and also you mentioned this way to collect things and photos. Why do we document things? We want to get some overview, we want to get behind the facts and so on, or we want to recollect something, and this is also about control. I think it could be really interesting to follow this trace a little further to get the connection from this to subversion and parody. In a way, well, how comes this into something that seems to be on control, obviously, even when an artist goes on to.
The last bit of most talks don't get written chronological, but the last bit that I spoke was the last bit that I wrote, but I think you said it. You said it far better than I did. I think this. It's complicated. I think part of this sort of argument about simulation and the world being a simulation of itself and behaviours being simulations of themselves, everything from people running tests in laboratories, Prince Charles building a town, to family albums that are pretending to be something else. The world has a capacity to do that to itself, and in many ways that's its own opinion sense. That's the only way it exists, by allowing itself the space for its own fantasy that goes on, which is really also terrifying. That people can tell themselves they're doing one thing when they're really doing another. The role that photography plays in that is obviously twofold. It's part of on one hand, it seems to be part of the construction of various lies we tell about ourselves, but it also has within it the capacity to, under the right circumstances, to say something about all of that. But at the same time, I think all of those questions that we were supposed to never ask ourselves anymore about, medium specificity. What's the medium all about? We were supposed to, photography was supposed to be embraced because it was the post-medium medium. It could be anything you like. When you actually look around at a lot of the work, they are interested in, artists are, and I am as a photographer, interested in what the medium really is. That changes. At one moment it was all about the shutter and the decisive moment. That's gone. It's now all about the degree to which you can make, this very static, meditative kind of picture. That's around a lot. That doesn't answer it, but I think artists are interested in the world and they're interested in their medium. I can't say it any better than that. And this seems to be the way now, something of the way now that people want to try and do it. But it's hard. That makes it sound very strategic, and I know, because I don't think like this when I'm a practitioner, when I'm making photographic work, but when I have to think more critically about it, those are the kinds of things I notice, and you try and frame them in a certain way. I don't know if any of this is true. It feels like speculation to me, because it's a very new way for me to think about it, but it might just be handy coincidence that practitioners that are here seem to sort of fit in with something of what I'm saying.
It's almost like a double, I think it's almost like a sort of double investigation where you're on the one hand investigating into the world around and through the thing that you're making and working out what you're, where you are, what you're looking at, and also what you're trying to say about it, but that kind of goes hand in hand with actually thinking about what the medium is that you're using and what that can actually be, what you can actually do with photograph, in terms of, for yourself. I'm saying that hasn't been done before by other people, but just in terms of myself as a practitioner, thinking how can I think about photograph, what can I actually realise within that that maybe I haven't realising before. Actually working with it. I'm just thinking back to the way I was thinking, when I was talking at the end about things becoming more like a painting, and obviously it isn't like a painting because it's still a perfect, smooth photographic surface, but almost thinking about how you can begin to think about the photographic surface in that way, rather than just as a sealed surface that has something inside that you project into, but it actually has things on that surface as well. But it's sort of like they go together to.
Yeah. Well, I thought that was really good, because I know your background is painting. And when you were talking about, I think it was the image of the balloons that was on the screen, and you were saying, you're interested in these as marks that are made, one negative, and end up as a print, And really cool, which lots of photographers are, or we are, when we look at photographs, between sort of flatness and depth. And I'm thinking, yeah, that balloon's darker because it's further away from the camera, but Anne wants me to think about it as just another thing that's on the flat field of the surface. And then Stefan was saying, well, I really want this picture in because it's, you know, you can see the space and you can see the depth. And back to very old questions about depth and surface and photography. They don't go away, these things. You're also very different because you also got, you have these, there's a real difference between the pictures that have backs, as Clement Greenberg used to say, and the pictures that have horizons. And the ones that have backs automatically feel like this chamber of theatre, and then, and we all know what it's like if you have a stage picture and you do it out in the real world. There's all kinds of other
Random.
issues that come up. You want to say something on a beach or something. Yeah. Flatness there.
Great. Any other questions for our panel? Okay, there's a one up here. Okay, sorry. It's very hard with the lights in your eyes to see the back of the screen.
Hello. I'd like to ask Anne a question just to continue the point that David was talking to her about. It's about the quality of your work when it's in the kind of constructed form. Sorry, the scenes keep going. Have you not considered yourself as an installation artist? Because it seems to me that you've got two pieces of work there. You've got the installation and the creation, a sculptural installation, and then you've got your photograph. And that follows the kind of the tradition of people like Richard Long, whose work ends up being a document of the work. And I just wondered whether you considered that. It also seems to me that Trish also has an element of that, and that the live performance of the documentation has also got a strength as well, you know, real integrity.
Absolutely, yeah, something we can actually touch on, which I wanted to talk about but forgot, is the performance element to the work. And in fact, it's the one thing, because I don't know if you know other work that I've done before and what I'm doing at the moment, even though they actually look quite different, the one thing that links them all is the performance element. And I think, again, back to the language of photography and about how we actually react to a camera in real life, we immediately become performers. But also the performance, the actual performance at the moment of capture is what you see. But what you don't see and what you'll never see is the build-up to it, and the backstory and the background to it. Having said that, what I'm working on at the moment, I'm thinking of actually videoing the whole process, because it involves members of the public this time rather than family members, and it's quite a different way of working. But on the other hand, I'm wondering about whether I should actually show that side, whether the performance, because in some ways it's almost like your sketches, it's like your jotter. It's like what you do when you're working something out, and then what you show is the final result of that. And I'm not sure that it needs to be able to, you need to be able to show your workings out, and your back of the envelope, pencil bits, you know, I don't know, it's a question, it's a good question.
I mean, yeah, it's an interesting thing. I mean, for me, people do often ask that question because of the nature of the work, but I think it brings up the sort of fundamental thing of why the work is photography, really, for me, because I'm not actually interested in the installation, as it were, and it's not, and it doesn't exist in the way that you see it in the photograph, because of the way, you know, because of how photography works. For first reason, that obviously you set a certain viewpoint and you light something in a certain way, and then you build it up with lots of different lighting and many different exposures, and the way that your eyes work, you know, film receives light and things like that, but actually what you see in the image you would never see in the studio. You could never realise that as an installation, it could never exist in the same way. So that's one point, but also the other point for me is the fact that you can't as a viewer, you can't ever touch that space, you can never fully understand it. It's always something that remains in a way at a distance that you can't answer, you can't go up and go, oh yeah, I can see how this has been fixed together, and it's just an illusion, because I don't, you know, obviously it is an illusion, but I want it to be primarily something that you believe and you enter into, so that you can relate it back to the world you're part of, rather than thinking about it as kind of made object in that sculptural way.
So by showing the workings out, the illusion would evaporate, basically.
I think there'd be no point, and it's
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
a completely different thing. Completely different thing.
Any other questions? Okay, can we have this one here?
Yes, I've got this one. I've got a question for Trish, actually. In looking at some of your pictures, I originally saw one of your images in the leaflet, and it looks like another kind of portrait, post-portrait picture that I've seen. You know, not to do down what's been done by Ryan Capistra and people like that. There are 10 to a dozen pictures of southern looking teenagers. But obviously, it's a different thing that comes, when you realise, how they were produced. And I just wanted to ask you, obviously, you could have staged these pictures of people that weren't real family members, and I wanted to ask you what qualities the fact that you were genuine players brought to the integrity of the photograph that might have been different if you had used, set them up as kind of, real staged, because they were staged, but they were staged with personality, really, weren't they? So, just wanted to ask about the integrity of the photograph, really.
I'm not quite sure what the question is, because you're saying that it's staged, but they're not.
It's really about, you could have chosen to have done those pictures with people that weren't real family members, but you chose.
I got you, yeah, okay. Well, what I needed to have, I actually started making the work with having I've got these 5 of us kids, adults, whatever. This generation, whatever we are. And I had started working with my brothers and my other sister as well, but it didn't work because they were too self-conscious. So and things that I asked them to do, they would have opinions about, and they couldn't actually do them. Whereas this particular sister worked incredibly well and would do exactly as I told her and not move a muscle until she was brilliant. But why, and then what, so that sort of in some way it forced a way of working that I hadn't actually originally intended. Originally I'd intended on what I was interested in was, as I said from the beginning, was this sort of shape-shifting that happens within family photography, or within family itself, in fact within life. You can sort of, you're one thing in one environment and you're another thing in another environment. So I originally wanted all of my brothers and sisters to play different roles within the family, but it just became an absolute mess that was just incomprehensible, and it was just ridiculous. So once I could hone it down to one sister, you still have that sort of familiarity. You could see that we were related because we looked similar, and yet we were sort of able to sort of shape shift a little bit, and sort of through studying how people stand and how you set your face, and the way that a certain time and a certain era, what people wore, and how all those things came together. That was the framework on which we could then move the meaning of the photograph and what I was actually putting in the photograph on. So it was an evolution. There was never sort of a prescribed idea from the beginning. It took several goes, if you like, probably about a year of goes to get to that point. So the idea of using other people would never have worked.
And what about the the personal, the kind of feeling, emotion stuff that comes from the fact that it's a real, it was nearer to the original real scenario.
Well, 7 years in it's not only the age gap between myself and my sister, but how it felt that I was, the actual drama of making that photograph. Because even though I say it's not based, it is based, that it's not fact, that it's not actually family history, my family history. That all comes into it. It's part biographical, there's no doubt. There's a term which I think fits really well, which somebody has described the work as being like autofiction, which is a term often used for literature, where you have a sort of weaving of fact and fiction together. And I think that's probably not answering the question, but it's trying to.
Thank you.
Okay, can we have one final question before we break for lunch? So, in the centre here.
We may have two questions for two members of the panel.
If we have time.
Yeah, first for David. In this grey area between documentary and cinematographic, you have other artists like Anne was saying that they don't want to be called performance artists or installation artists, like for instance Dick Muniz, who basically works in painting, but he's a photographer, or does projection on the sky and photographs. Also, on another dimension, Andy Goldsworthy as well, which his work is ephemeral and photographs is what remains as a document. So I thought that was kind of missing in this kind of limbo between documentary and cinematographic that you use within Jeff Ward's. So that's the first question. Where do these sorts of practices fit? And the other question, which I think is not really related, but is for Steph. What's the difference? I mean, every urban planning needs to be utopic, right? I mean, in the core of it, maybe. And you said that you had to kind of get rid a bit of the human elements of it, but there were still some left, like padlock or some plants. So, you know, what's the difference of just getting another town that is being planned, like Barcelona or something, and emptying it out and just photographing exactly the same sort of eeriness of your pictures? What's the difference of choosing this kind of complete project of utopianism, probably? So, yes.
I can stitch them together a bit, those two. Just thinking about our relation to the totally planned in the world and the totally unplanned, both of which fill us with a certain horror. And most of the world is in that grey area in the middle. You're right, though, that the task of newness, any kind of newness, has some kind of utopian dimension about it, and this has always been difficult for planners of images or of towns, because in coming up with the new, you end up making an over-identification, an over-clean fit between representations and what people are supposed to do with them. So when I look at the Poundbury pictures that Stephanie showed, I have to fight myself from imagining that all the citizens of Poundbury identify in a rather sort of Stepford-Wives-like way with their environment. The point is, some of them probably don't. Some of them were probably real Prince Charlesists and were desperate to get in there. But the world, when it ceases to become new, ceases to become quite so planned, and you don't have to over-identify it with it. It's like saying that everyone lives in a tower block is a tower blockist, or contrarily is utterly fixed by the horror of the tower block. You know, most people's lives take place in a kind of messy area between the planned and the unplanned. And so Wall's idea about the documentary and the cinematographic is at least a kind of mapping out the two extremes, neither of which in the end is totally satisfactory for us as explanations or as ways of working. It has a real bearing on photography, I think, in a very interesting way, because if you look at all the accounts of realism in photography, they all hinge on the fact that photography gives you more than you want. I photograph this glass and I get everyone else behind. I don't plan for them, I don't have to plan for them, and I get them. But the realism of the picture of the glass is a result of all of the extra stuff that's in the frame as well. The reality effect, Bart called it. He was actually writing about literature at that moment. You know, Dickens would endlessly describe totally irrelevant detail, people's hair, their wallpaper, their clothing, but the sheer excess of detail is what guarantees the real. So when we get a picture like Anne's, I'd have thought, where there's no hierarchy between what looks planned and what looks unplanned. I look at the mess on the floor and the stains on the wall, and I think, oh, Anne's been there. This is no accident. There's a confusion of the planned and the unplanned. Right? There's a lot of that going on. Rightly, that's the condition that we live in now. And we're always trying to find a way between the planned and the unplanned, because they both terrify us.
Like I tried to mention, that for me, Hungary very much quite like where you hit. It's just an example for me. I use it as an example for the whole question I raised myself: what is urban planning, and quite frankly also what is, to some basic form, new urbanism. What is that? So when I said what I found interesting also with the way this kind of cool detached photography works was very much that it became about the sameness of so much else. So you're quite right, it becomes about the sameness of this kind of, any of these strangely planned, urban, suburban, whatever you find everywhere. And that's exactly the common where I said from suddenly where something is very specifically local and can be mapped for me, it suddenly becomes much more universal, and that it can speak about basically more raise these questions of what, quite frankly, like you said, what is an utopian setting ever? And it is opposed upon us, which with these rules and building codes, could it ever be possible? And quite frankly, for me, it's a kind of strange scenario to have a building code that supposes a certain community, like David said, that supposes to be like to go according to plan, and of course it doesn't. So I guess starting the work there was always a failure in it that I was very aware of, but it's much more about so many other planned environments I find, and they seem to be all the same.
And do you think that there's some sort of a warning, like this might
I'm not
go
a
wrong?
moralist. Sorry. I'm not a moralist. It's not my role.
This is gone horribly wrong or something.
I think you can continue that discussion over lunch. We will take another.
Expect a report back.
Otherwise.